All right, what's going on, everyone? Today we're going to take a look at some updates around the ongoing war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. We've got Israel saying that they've eliminated a handful of Hamas high-value targets in and around the Shifa hospital. Some statements from the Joe Rogan podcast that have gone pretty viral and I thought were worth addressing. Families of hostages in Israel are pushing back against Netanyahu and calling for an election to replace him. And then amidst the general downward trend, I would say, in relations between the United States and Israel in recent days and weeks, especially around the possibility of an operation in Rafah, the U.S. just shipped a bunch of additional weapons to Israel. So starting with the Israeli operation in and around Shifa, a few months ago, Israel first moved into this complex, cleared much of the complex out as well as some of the tunnels underneath. As they continued moving further south into central and southern Gaza, it looks like some Hamas leadership figures and fighters have moved back into the hospital complex. And in the last few days, Israel says that they have identified and eliminated 4 high-value targets. Now, quick note on the concept of high-value targets or key leaders or high-level personnel, whatever we want to phrase these folks. Generally, in this context, what we're talking about are personnel inside of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad that Israel has been tracking. They know their name, they have a position within the organization, and they have some level of responsibility within Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I think there's been a misunderstanding in the past, perhaps when Israel rolls out this list of high-value targets that they've eliminated, and it kind of gives the idea that, Hamas is on the verge of collapsing. Like 10 are eliminated, 12, 15, 20, and there's nobody left within Hamas to fight. And that's really not how this should be viewed. By comparison, if you look at a brigade combat team in the U.S. Army or a brigade, a captain or a first sergeant at the company level would be considered a key leader. And there's 30 or so of those in a brigade. So 1 out of 30 isn't really going to do anything. Even battalion commander, you're talking about 5 or 6 in a brigade, 1 or 2 of those removed. It's pretty high level, and the organization is still going to be able to function. So Hamas is no different in that context. As their senior leaders, as their high-value targets fall, are eliminated, captured, or killed by Israel, there's somebody else stepping in to fill those ranks, take over their responsibilities. It does, however, at the very least, cause a disruption in the organization, and eventually, once Israel gets to the highest level and starts taking out the top leaders of Hamas, it could have catastrophic consequences on the organization as a whole. So Israel says that during the course of the Shifa operation, they encountered and killed a group of armed Hamas operatives who ran out of the Shifa emergency room. They say among them was a Hamas commander, Rod Thabat, named by the IDF on Thursday as the head of the terror group's recruitment and supply acquisition, as well as Mahmoud Khalil Zakzouk, who the IDF says is the deputy commander of Hamas's rocket unit in Gaza City. In another incident in Shifa Hospital, Israel says that they killed senior Hamas operatives Fadi Douaik and Zachariah Najib during a chase in the Shifa maternity ward. So this is happening in operational sections of the hospital, or maybe they're not, but it seems like if there's any areas that would still be functioning, it would be the maternity ward and the emergency room, and those are 2 areas where these engagements took place, or at least where they were initiated. Israel says that Douaik was a senior member of Hamas's intelligence division, and Najib, according to the IDF and Shin Bet, was a senior operative in Hamas's West Bank headquarters tasked with advancing attacks against Israel from the West Bank. So something we've seen throughout this conflict is a lot of thoughts or speculation that Hamas that Hamas does not exist in the West Bank. They do. They have coordination cells inside of Gaza. They have elements inside of the West Bank. And when they carry out attacks, you have elements inside of Gaza praising those, calling them out, and celebrating that those actions were taken. Then there are some statements that came out of a Joe Rogan podcast episode this last week that went pretty viral, and I actually think are worth covering, at least hitting on a little bit here. Look, Joe Rogan is a comedian, an MMA announcer, but he has an incredible audience, like 190 million downloads for his show per month. That is staggering, right? It puts a lot of traditional media to shame. So when he says something, no matter what it might be, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, it gets a lot of attention. So in this context, I think it's worth covering because, again, whether you agree with these statements or not, a lot of people are going to hear them and it could shift a lot of public perception. Rogan said in talking about Israel, quote, "You guys are willing to do what was done to you that led you to believe that you needed to start your own country. You're willing to do that on a small scale in Gaza," referring to genocide. And he hinted at that in other statements, talking about Israel committing a genocide in Gaza. His guest there, Mesker, claimed that the U.S. government was seeking to ban TikTok to prevent Israeli soldiers from posting, quote, "all the war crimes that they commit on the social media platform. So again, I think what's notable here is Joe Rogan saying this does not make the accusation of genocide more or less true, right? He's operating with publicly available information that you and I are as well. The case for genocide has been made at the International Court of Justice. It is being heard. We'll wait and see what the appropriate authorities say as it relates to that. However, public perception is a very real thing and can influence U.S. policy and policy all around the world. And Rogan has a massive audience. So it's not crazy that people are hearing this for the first time or are very heavily influenced by what he has to say. And they take that and they go, you know what? Got it. Israel is committing a genocide. We're going to act appropriately, vote appropriately, contact our representatives appropriately, whatever it might be. Now, in terms of his guest here talking about the reason for the U.S. banning TikTok, this is a new one. I haven't heard this before. I actually kind of got my start on TikTok, all things considered. That's where I really first started publishing videos. There's a lot of problems on that platform, and I actually would be in favor of a divestment to a U.S. company. It's not even around the data collection aspect of it, which is significant, and it's not good that it's an adversary of the United States that owns it in China. But our data is being suctioned up by everyone on the internet. So that's not all that new. My personal view on the TikTok divestment is that we have an adversary that can very easily shape the algorithm in a way that focuses our conversation in one direction or another around very important aspects to U.S. national security. I don't think that's a good thing. I have heard a couple takes that one of the reasons that TikTok is going to be banned or that people want it banned is because it shows people the real truth of what is happening in Gaza or in other wars and conflict zones around the world. As in, TikTok is kind of this lone window that sees through all of the propaganda to show their audience what is actually happening out there in the world. I couldn't disagree with that more for a couple of reasons. First off, if you spend any time on TikTok, you're going to see it is chock full of dis and misinformation. I can't tell you the number of times I've been tagged in clips of American soldiers in Afghanistan with the caption saying U.S. forces just landed in Ukraine. Or the same about Gaza. U.S. forces operating in Iraq from 10 years ago, and it says, U.S. forces now on the ground in Gaza. Just blatant lies with hundreds of thousands, even millions of views, and it just goes viral out there. So there's a lot of bad information on TikTok, just like there is anywhere else. But the idea that removing TikTok somehow would shut down access to all of this other information, it's not realistic. So the information that's on TikTok is also out there on YouTube. It's on Facebook. It's on Instagram. It's on other social media platforms. And so the same kind of applies here to the idea that TikTok would be banned to stop the world from seeing Israeli soldiers posting their war crimes. That is a very significant step for the United States to take to try to cover, mistakes by soldiers in an allied country. And if TikTok goes down, guess where they're going to post their videos? Somewhere else, right? It's not like they're going to stop using the internet. So anyways, that was an interesting take, but in full disclosure, I haven't listened to the episode yet. It's on the list. I'll give it a listen here the next couple of days, doing some traveling, which is actually worth bringing up. So tomorrow I head out to Brussels, got invited to the NATO 75th anniversary ceremony. They invited a handful of creators from around the world to come out and kind of interact. They're opening up access to a lot of senior NATO personnel. We have sessions potentially right now with the Secretary General, NATO spokesperson, some ambassadors, possibly even the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, while we're there to be able to ask whatever questions we, or more importantly, our audience has. Right, so the arrangement here is there's no money changing hands. This is not a sponsorship deal with NATO. They're not sponsoring this channel. They haven't sponsored past videos, not sponsoring future videos. They're covering transportation to and from Brussels and lodging while in Brussels. And then they don't even have approval over what or how much we talk about. So technically, I could go over there, have this whole experience with NATO, get to meet all these people and have these great conversations, and then come back and say, actually, I'm good. I'm not going to talk about that at all. What they're banking on is that we take that information and want to relay it to you all, what we learned in our own voice, take apart what we think is important and relevant to you and what you might be interested in. So I like it. I think NATO is actually going about this in a really good way. Again, no obligation from NATO to post anything, and they're not vetting any information before it comes out. The way I'm soliciting questions for this, I'll be publishing kind of updates across social media, but I'll link Substack, an article in Substack in the description below. That's how we're kind of consolidating any big questions you might have, and we'll tackle those first and foremost over anything else. And then when I get back this following week, we'll go ahead and put out a longer form video kind of answering as many of those questions as we can from the experience in Brussels. And we are starting to see some pushback in Israel. This is something I'm going to have to lean a little bit on the Israeli audience to help me understand exactly how impactful this is. But some pushback from the families of the hostages against Netanyahu, calling for not necessarily his resignation, but for elections to possibly replace him. News just came out that 16 relatives of the hostages took part in an emergency press conference on Saturday evening, criticizing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's failure to bring their loved ones home. In a major development, they say the families called for the removal of Netanyahu through elections. And there's a couple quotes here from the families of these hostages that are still being held in Gaza, where they say, quote, "The Prime Minister left us no choice. We all saw how Netanyahu repeatedly botched a deal for the return of the hostages. We saw how his personal political interest drives him time and time again in making decisions, and how his concern for coalition stability outweighs his clear duty to bring our loved ones home. We were told to sit still. We were told to travel the world, but after 6 months, the hostages are still in Gaza. This is a complete and deliberate failure." And then another family member said, quote, "We are forced to do everything in our power to remove the obstacle, which is you," referring to Netanyahu. "And we are forced to start a new phase in our struggle. From now on, we will work to replace you." So again, I'd lean on the Israeli viewers. Please add some context in the comments below. I've said before, I have a hard time understanding American politics, and let alone the politics in another country, let alone in a time of war. And what we're talking about here, calling for new elections, is, of course, a very political move. So I'm not entirely sure. It's notable that this is getting news and it's making headlines. There has been pushback against Netanyahu from the very start. I don't want to pretend like this is the very first time that anyone in Israel has pushed back against him. But it's notable to see more coverage of the families of the hostages pushing back and outright calling for elections to replace Netanyahu. So again, I'll lean on the Israeli viewers. If you would, please add some context in the comments below, so the rest of us, not tied in super tight with Israeli politics, can understand just how impactful or not moves like this actually are. And we have seen a lot of back and forth between the United States and Israel in recent weeks, specifically around Israel's apparent desire to continue their operation into the southern Gaza city of Rafah. It's the last major holdout in Gaza where Israeli forces really have not operated on the ground quite yet. It's believed that a lot of the Hamas leadership is holed up there, along with, and the reason that it is so contentious, along with a major portion of the Gaza population. Right? It's kind of the last area they fled to. By and large, the United States and other countries around the world have kind of pleaded for Israel to not move into Rafah, saying the humanitarian catastrophe there would be significant. But amidst all of this, and then Israel was going to send a contingent or delegation to Washington to kind of war game other ideas, to deal with Hamas but not go into Rafah, maybe targeted raids, things like that. So the relationship here is on the rocks, to say the least. But amidst all of this, the United States just authorized the transfer of billions of dollars worth of bombs and fighter jets to Israel, even as they kind of publicly talk about these differences in opinions. And I thought a lot of this was worth getting into. So this new arms package includes 1,800 Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs and 500 Mark 82 500-pound bombs, along with 25 F-35s that were initially approved as part of a larger package by Congress in 2008. So that second part is notable. Those F-35s are not a new ask. It sounds like that is just the most recent delivery. However, the way this article is written, it sounds like those 1,800 2,000-pound bombs and 500 500-pound bombs are part of a new ask of Israel, or that Israel made of the United States. A White House official told the Washington Post, quote, "We have continued to support Israel's right to defend himself. Conditioning aid has not been a part of our policy." And that's been one of the major criticisms, if you will, of the Biden administration when people looking at how Israel is conducting this war. When people say that the U.S. should be doing more, this is what they point to. They say, how about you condition aid? How about you condition the military equipment going over that Israel acts in a certain way or does not do something particular on the battlefield. In fact, the U.S. kind of hit on this recently. They put together a memorandum that they sent out to countries, any country that is on the receiving end of U.S. military equipment, saying that if they are to receive U.S. military equipment, they had to use those in line with international law and would not block humanitarian assistance into the war zone. Israel had, I believe, 40 or 45 days to sign this because they were involved in an active war. Countries not at war had like 180 days to sign this. Essentially, it was a way for the U.S. to be able to check a box and say, we are only sending weapons to countries that are adhering to international law. Look, it says so on this piece of paper by somebody who can confirm it. It sounds like that came back to the United States. They signed that. The deadline was last week, I believe. They say this assurance came last week via a, quote, credible high-level official who has the ability and authority to make decisions and commitments about the issues at the heart of the assurances. It's a lot of words. That's coming from State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller, who went on to say, quote, that statement there is just full of very government press conference phrase there, isn't it? Then Miller went on to say, quote, we've had ongoing assessments of Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law. We have not found them to be in violation either when it comes to the conduct of the war or the provision of humanitarian assistance. We view those assurances through the ongoing work that we have done. So what Miller's saying here essentially is that, yes, Israel confirmed that they are adhering to international humanitarian law and also allowing for the provision of humanitarian assistance in Gaza. Not only did Israel say they're doing that, but we can confirm as well that Israel is meeting all of these obligations. So again, for all of the back and forth between Israel and the United States in recent weeks, what we're seeing actually come from that is the U.S. is providing additional weapons to Israel, and they're kind of holding the line here, saying that there are no violations of international humanitarian law, and Israel is still doing everything they can to get aid into Gaza. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, linked in the description below. We just changed the name there to Between the Lines by Preston Stewart, because it's not just me, it's a whole team of experts, analysts, researchers that are contributing 3 articles a week. Also, that's where we're going to be consolidating questions for the coming trip to NATO. So if there's any burning questions about the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, hop over to Substack, submit those questions, and I'll do my absolute best to get those answered for you. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.